Most Christians have never heard the real story behind the Sermon on the Mount. What you learned in church about Jesus' most famous teaching is only the surface layer, a collection of nice moral guidelines that make you feel inspired but don't fundamentally challenge your life. The original Sermon on the Mount? Far more dangerous, radical, and subversive than you ever imagined. In the next few minutes, discover what this revolutionary manifesto actually meant to first-century Jewish listeners, and why it nearly got Jesus killed. This isn't a general Sunday school lesson about being nice to others. This is scripture in its full historical context, and it will shatter everything you thought you knew about following Jesus. Most Christians have never heard that the Sermon on the Mount wasn't just a collection of beautiful sayings. It was a direct challenge to the entire religious and political establishment of Jesus' day. When Jesus climbed that mountainside and began to speak, he wasn't giving a motivational speech. He was declaring war on the status quo. Let's start with something that will shock you. The famous phrase, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," that opens Beatitudes? Most Christians think this means being humble or spiritually needy. But the Greek word tochos that Jesus used doesn't mean humble. It means destitute, completely broke, reduced to begging. Jesus wasn't talking about having a humble attitude. He was talking about people who had been economically crushed by an unjust system. Picture the scene. Jesus is speaking to crowds of Galilean peasants who are literally starving under Roman taxation and religious exploitation. When he says, "Blessed are the poor," these people look around at each other and think, he's talking about us, the ones the religious leaders say are cursed by God for being poor. Jesus just flipped their entire understanding of divine favor upside down. But it gets more radical. When Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," he's not talking about personal piety. The word righteousness in Hebrew is tzedek, which means justice. Social justice, economic justice, legal justice. Jesus is saying, blessed are those who are desperately hungry for the world to be set right. This is revolutionary language that would have made Roman officials nervous and religious leaders furious. The religious establishment taught that poverty was punishment for sin, that wealth was a sign of God's blessing, and that the current system was divinely ordained. Jesus just told a crowd of oppressed people that they were the blessed ones, that they were hungry for justice, and that change was coming. No wonder they wanted to make him king by force later on. Here's where it gets even more dangerous. Jesus doesn't stop with comforting the oppressed. He directly confronts their oppressors. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The word meek doesn't mean weak or passive. It's the same word used to describe Moses, who confronted Pharaoh and led a slave rebellion. Meek means having power under control, like a war horse that obeys its rider. Jesus is telling the powerless that they will inherit what the powerful currently possess. This is economic revolution wrapped in spiritual language, and everyone listening knew it. Most people completely miss the subversive nature of, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Jesus isn't just offering alternative interpretations of the law. He's claiming authority equal to Moses himself. In a culture where questioning religious interpretation to get you stoned, Jesus is saying, the religious leaders have been teaching you wrong. Here's what God actually means. Take the famous passage about turning the other cheek. Sunday school taught you this means being passive in the face of violence. But look at the historical context. A right-handed person slapping someone's right cheek would use the back of their hand. The insulting slap a master gives a slave, a Roman gives a Jew, a man gives a woman. It's about humiliation, not violence. Jesus is saying, when someone treats you as inferior, don't just take it, but don't respond with violence either. Turn your other cheek. This forces the aggressor to either stop or hit you with their palm, which treats you as an equal. It's brilliant nonviolent resistance that robs the oppressor their power to humiliate you. This isn't passive submission. It's active dignity maintenance that exposes injustice. The same principle applies to, if someone sues you for your coat, give them your cloak also. Under Roman law, you could sue someone for their outer garment to pay a debt. But if they gave you their undergarment too, they'd be standing naked in court. Public nudity brought shame on the viewer, not the naked person in Jewish culture. Jesus is teaching economic civil disobedience that exposes the injustice of a system that strips people of their basic necessities. And if someone forces you to carry their pack 1 mile, carry it too? Roman soldiers could legally force civilians to carry their equipment for 1 mile. But going 2 miles would get the soldier in trouble with his commander for exceeding his legal authority. Jesus is teaching people how to turn oppressive systems against themselves through unexpected generosity that creates legal problems for oppressors. This isn't about being nice. This is guerrilla warfare training disguised as moral teaching. Here's what will really challenge your comfortable Christianity. Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies wasn't abstract theological advice. It was specific instruction for how to survive under brutal occupation. When Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, he's talking to people whose enemies aren't just personal rivals. Their enemies are Roman soldiers who crucify rebels, tax collectors who steal their family's survival money, and religious leaders who exclude them from God's love. Jesus is teaching them something revolutionary. The way to defeat an enemy system isn't become like it, but to transform it through unexpected love. This doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means responding to injustice in a way that exposes its evil and offers something better. Love becomes a weapon against oppression because it reveals the humanity of both oppressor and oppressed. But notice this crucial detail. Jesus never tells the powerful to love the powerless. He never tells Romans to love Jews, or rich people to love poor people, or religious leaders to love outcasts. This teaching is specifically for the oppressed, giving them a way to maintain their souls while resisting their oppression. Most Christians miss the economic revolution hidden in the Lord's Prayer. When Jesus teaches, give us this day our daily bread, the word daily appears nowhere else in ancient Greek literature. Scholars think Jesus invented it. The closest meaning is bread for the coming day, bread for tomorrow. Jesus is teaching people to pray for economic security in a world where most people never knew if they'd eat tomorrow. Forgive us our debts isn't about spiritual forgiveness primarily. It's about literal debt forgiveness. In the ancient world, debt led to slavery, land loss, and family breakup. When Jesus teaches people to pray for debt forgiveness, he's praying for economic justice. And when he says, as we forgive our debtors, he's creating a community where people practice the economic mercy they're asking God for. This is why the prayer includes, lead us not into temptation, which is better translated, don't let us be put to the test. The test is whether you'll maintain integrity when economic pressure tempts you to compromise your values or exploit others. The Lord's Prayer is a blueprint for surviving as God's people in an unjust economic system. If you're starting to see the Sermon on the Mount differently, hit that like button now, because what comes next will completely transform how you read Jesus' most challenging teachings. The section about not storing up treasures on earth isn't about having a good attitude toward money. It's about opting out an economy based on exploitation. Jesus says, you cannot serve both God and money, using the word mammon, which refers specifically to wealth gained through oppression. He's not condemning all wealth. He's condemning wealth that comes from participating in unjust systems. When Jesus says, consider the lilies of the field, he's not teaching prosperity theology or careless living. He's teaching economic resistance. The anxiety he's addressing isn't general worry. It's the specific fear that keeps oppressed people participating in systems that destroy their souls. Jesus is saying, God's creation shows us there's another way to live. You don't have to sell your integrity to survive. This teaching would have been incredibly challenging to people living under economic oppression. Easy for Jesus to say, but what about when your children are hungry? Jesus isn't being naive. He's teaching people that there's a difference between responsible provision and anxious participation in injustice. He's calling them to trust that living God's way, even when it seems economically risky, is actually the safest way to live. The famous judge not passage is completely misunderstood by modern Christians who use it to avoid accountability. Jesus isn't teaching relativism or tolerance of sin. He's teaching about the difference between righteous judgment and hypocritical condemnation. The context is about removing the log from your own eye first, which means deal with your own participation in unjust systems before condemning others for theirs. Jesus is teaching oppressed people not to become like their oppressors by adopting their judgmental attitudes. But he's also teaching them to see clearly enough to help others remove the specks from their eyes. This is about creating communities of accountability and restoration, not avoiding moral standards. The narrow gate and difficult path that Jesus describes isn't about getting into heaven after death. It's about finding the way to live as God's people in the present world. The wide path that leads to destruction is the way of conformity to unjust systems. Most people take that path because it seems safer and easier. The narrow path is the way of resistance, justice, and costly discipleship that few people choose. Jesus ends the sermon with the parable of building on rock versus sand. This isn't about having correct beliefs. It's about putting his teachings into practice. The rock is the foundation of actually living out these radical teachings about justice, nonviolent resistance, economic sharing, and enemy love. The sand is trying to follow Jesus while maintaining comfortable participation in unjust systems. The storms that reveal whether your foundation is solid aren't natural disasters. They're the persecution, economic pressure, and social rejection that come when you actually live out Jesus' teachings. Most Christians never experience these storms because they never build in ways that challenge the systems Jesus opposed. Here's the truth that will make you uncomfortable. If your Christianity doesn't put you in tension with unjust systems, you're not following the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount. You're following a domesticated version that's been stripped of its revolutionary power. Jesus' audience was astonished at his teaching because he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. They weren't amazed because he was nicer than other teachers. They were amazed because he had the authority to challenge the entire religious and political system and offer a completely different way to live. The Sermon on the Mount isn't a list of impossible standards designed to make you feel guilty. It's a practical manual for how to live as God's people in a world dominated by systems that oppose God's justice. It's training for spiritual revolutionaries who will transform the world to the power of self-sacrificing love. This is why early Christians were seen as a threat to the Roman Empire. They weren't just offering personal salvation. They were demonstrating an alternative way to organize society. They shared resources, refused military service, treated slaves as equals, included outcasts, and created communities where the last were first and the first were last. The tragedy of modern Christianity is that we've turned the Sermon on the Mount into individual spiritual advice instead of recognizing it as the blueprint for communities that challenge unjust systems through radical love. We've made it about personal piety instead of social transformation. But here's the good news. It's not too late to recover the revolutionary heart of Jesus' teaching. You can start living out the Sermon on the Mount today by looking for ways to practice economic justice, nonviolent resistance, enemy love, and community accountability in your own context. The power of the Sermon on the Mount isn't that it makes you feel inspired. It's that it gives you practical tools for following Jesus in a world that still needs transformation. These aren't impossible standards. They're the training manual for people who are serious about being part of God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. If this helped you see the Sermon on the Mount in a completely new light, tap subscribe now and turn on notifications. These revolutionary teachings of Jesus need to be heard by every Christian who's ready to move beyond comfortable religion to costly discipleship. Share this with someone who needs to discover the real power of Jesus' most famous sermon. The world needs Christians who understand that following Jesus isn't about being nice. It's about being part of God's radical transformation of everything that's broken in this world.